You used to be sharper than this, Ethan said, his voice smooth as polished glass, just loud enough to carry across the table, and just quiet enough to sound like concern instead of cruelty. And the laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough, a soft ripple through a room filled with tailored suits and diamond earrings, the kind of room where judgment didn't need to shout to be heard. And Clara felt it land on her skin like a fine dust she couldn't brush off as she stood beneath the glow of a chandelier the size of a small car. It's like catching the edges of her simple navy dress, a dress chosen for comfort more than spectacle, a dress that didn't belong in a room like this. Not anymore, not after everything had changed, and Ethan, with one hand casually wrapped around a glass of champagne, gestured lightly toward her as if she were an afterthought. Motherhood shifts priorities, he added, his tone laced with something that sounded almost like sympathy, but not quite. Never quite. And a woman across the table tilted her head, offering Clara a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile reserved for someone who had quietly fallen out of relevance. And Clara returned it with a small nod, her fingers tightening around the clutch in her hand, the leather warm from the heat of her palm, her body still unfamiliar to her in ways she hadn't yet found words for. 3 months since the baby. 3 months of sleepless nights measured in ounces of milk and minutes of rest. 3 months of rebuilding something invisible that no one in this room could see. And yet here she was, standing in heels she hadn't worn in nearly a year, her posture steady even as a faint tremor moved through her fingers, a detail no one noticed, or perhaps no one cared to notice, because in their eyes, she had already been redefined, reduced to something softer, smaller, a version of herself that no longer fit the sharp, glittering edges of Ethan's world. And Ethan leaned back slightly, confident, composed, already moving on to his next conversation about funding rounds and expansion plans, his voice gaining energy as he spoke about numbers, projections, the future he was building, a future that seemed to have no space left for the woman who had once stood beside him as an equal. And Clara watched him for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze steady, unreadable, not wounded the way they expected, not broken the way he assumed, but quiet, deeply quiet, like still water that hid something vast beneath its surface. And when she finally looked away, it wasn't in retreat, it was with a calm that felt almost out of place in a room driven by noise and performance. And somewhere beyond the walls of this ballroom, in offices lined with glass and steel, decisions were being signed, approvals moving through channels invisible to the people sipping champagne under golden light, numbers aligning, authority shifting hands without announcement. And Clara's phone, tucked silently into her clutch, vibrated once, a subtle, private signal that something had just been set in motion, something final, something irreversible. But she didn't check it, she didn't need to, because she already knew. And as Ethan's laughter rose again behind her, confident and unchallenged, Clara took a slow breath, her shoulders settling, her expression smoothing into something composed, something controlled, as if she were already standing somewhere else entirely, somewhere he had not yet realized he was about to enter. The music swelled again, filling the spaces where silence might have exposed too much, and Clara moved through the crowd with measured steps, each one steady, deliberate, as if she were relearning how to exist in a world that had quietly decided she no longer belonged. And yet nothing in her expression asked for permission, nothing in the way she held her chin suggested uncertainty, even as the whispers followed her like a faint echo, softened by polite smiles and half-finished conversations. That paused just long enough to notice her before moving on, and across the room Ethan was already surrounded, his voice animated now, energized by attention, by opportunity, by the promise of expansion that hung in the air like a contract waiting to be signed. And Clara could hear fragments of it as she passed, phrases like capital injection and strategic partnership, numbers that sounded impressive to those who did not understand where they truly came from. And she paused briefly near a marble column, her fingers brushing lightly against its cool surface, grounding herself in something solid, something real, because the rest of this world felt curated, staged, a performance she had once believed in. And her mind drifted, not backward into pain, but sideways into clarity, to quiet rooms filled with glass walls and low voices, to documents that required precision instead of charm, to signatures that carried weight far beyond what anyone in this ballroom could imagine. And she remembered the first time she had sat at that long table months ago, still carrying the exhaustion of sleepless nights, her body not yet her own again, while men twice her age had spoken carefully, measuring their words, because they understood exactly who she was even if they never said it out loud. And they had not seen a fragile woman. They had seen authority, final and absolute. And she had listened, asked questions, made decisions that moved millions of dollars with the same quiet certainty she now carried in her posture. And back in the present, her phone vibrated again, softer this time, almost like a confirmation, and she did not look at it. But she felt the shift, the invisible alignment of pieces, falling into place, because somewhere, just a few miles away, a deal Ethan had been chasing for over a year had just crossed the final threshold, approved, authorized, released, and his future, the one he was proudly describing to anyone who would listen, was no longer a possibility but a reality, one that rested entirely in hands he had just dismissed as irrelevant. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing as if she had been carrying something heavy that no one else could see. And when she turned slightly, her gaze found Ethan again, his confidence unshaken, his smile effortless, completely unaware that the foundation beneath him had already shifted. And for a brief moment something almost like sadness flickered through her eyes, not for what he had said, but for what he still did not understand. And then it was gone, replaced by a calm that was sharper than anger, quieter than pride, a kind of certainty that did not need to announce itself. And as a server passed by offering champagne, she declined with a gentle shake of her head, her focus no longer on the room or the people within it, but on what came next, because this was never the place where the truth would be revealed. This was only where the illusion had been allowed to exist, and somewhere else, behind glass doors and polished steel, the real conversation was about to begin, one where names carried weight, where signatures defined outcomes, and where Clara would not be introduced as someone who had changed, but as someone who had always been in control. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost surgical, the kind that stripped away illusion and left only structure. And Ethan stepped into the glass tower just after 9, his reflection moving alongside him in the polished surfaces, sharp suit, confident stride, the image of a man on the edge of something bigger, something definitive, and the energy in the building matched his own, quiet but charged, as if everyone already knew that today mattered. And as he entered the boardroom, the city stretched out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, a grid of ambition and consequence, and he allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction, because this was it, the deal that would cement everything he had been building, the funding that would transform projections into reality. And across the long table sat representatives from the bank, composed, professional, their expressions neutral in a way that revealed nothing and yet suggested everything was already decided. And Ethan began to speak, his voice steady, rehearsed but natural, outlining vision, growth, scale, each word placed with precision, each number reinforcing the narrative he had constructed so carefully. And for a moment, it worked. The room leaned in, the presentation held, the future felt tangible, until one of the executives glanced at the door, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to break the rhythm. And then the doors opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that drew every eye in the room. And Clara stepped inside, her presence altering the air without a single word, her navy dress replaced now with something more structured, more deliberate, her posture unchanged, composed, grounded, as if she had always belonged exactly here. And Ethan's voice faltered, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that most people would not notice. But he felt it, sharp and disorienting, as if the script he had been following had suddenly been rewritten without his knowledge. And one of the executives rose slightly, offering her a respectful nod that carried a weight Ethan did not yet understand. And then came the introduction, calm, formal, unmistakable, Miss Clara Cole, final approving authority for the funding structure. And the words did not land all at once. They unfolded slowly, each one dismantling something he had taken for granted. And Ethan turned fully toward her now, searching her face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, a coincidence, anything that could restore the logic he had been operating under. But there was no confusion in her expression, no hesitation. Only that same quiet steadiness he had dismissed the night before. And she took her seat at the head of the table, not with dominance, not with spectacle, but with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove, and the room adjusted around her, attention shifting, priorities realigning, as if an invisible axis had just been revealed. And for the first time since he had walked in, Ethan said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would not expose how little he had understood, and Clara met his gaze briefly, not to challenge him, not to humiliate him, but to acknowledge a truth that no longer needed explanation. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying across the room without force, outlining terms, confirming conditions, each sentence precise, each decision already made long before this moment. And as the meeting moved forward under her direction, Ethan sat there, the weight of realization settling in, not loud, not explosive, but undeniable, like a foundation shifting beneath a structure he had believed was entirely his own. And in that quiet collapse of certainty, he understood something he had never considered before, that power did not always announce itself, that it did not always look like control or volume or presence. Sometimes it looked like silence, like patience, like a woman he had underestimated standing exactly where she was meant to be. The meeting did not end with applause or raised voices. It ended the way real power always did, with signatures, quiet acknowledgments, and the subtle shifting of attention away from the man who had once commanded the room and toward the woman who now defined its outcome. And as chairs moved back and conversations resumed in low, controlled tones, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his hands resting on the table as if grounding himself in something that no longer felt stable, the skyline beyond the glass suddenly distant, almost irrelevant, because everything that had seemed within reach just hours ago had been reframed in a way he could not ignore. And Clara gathered her documents with measured precision, sliding them into a slim leather folder, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the tension that still lingered in the air. And when she stood, the executives instinctively made space for her, their respect not performative but practiced, as if this dynamic had always existed and today was simply the first time it had been revealed to him. And Ethan finally rose. As well, his posture still controlled, still composed, but there was a hesitation now, a fraction of uncertainty that had never been part of him before. And when their paths aligned near the end of the table, the space between them felt charged, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with something quieter, something more definitive. And he spoke first, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the effortless confidence he had worn so easily the night before. "Clara, I did not know." And the words lingered, incomplete, because there was no version of them that could fully capture what he meant. And Clara looked at him, really looked at him this time, not as the man who had once defined her world, but as someone she now understood from a distance, her gaze steady, neither cold nor forgiving, simply clear, and for a moment neither of them moved, the hum of the room continuing around them as if they were standing in a separate current of time. And then she spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, but carrying a weight that did not need emphasis. "You did not ask," and it was not an accusation, not a sharp edge meant to wound. It was a statement, simple and complete, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the truth of it settling in, because she was right. He had not asked, he had assumed, defined, reduced, all while believing he understood the full picture, and now that picture had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And Clara adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, a small, ordinary gesture that contrasted with everything else about the moment. And when she stepped past him, there was no hesitation, no need to linger, because whatever needed to be said had already been spoken, not in words, but in structure, in authority, in the quiet reality that now existed between them. And as she walked toward the door, the sunlight catching briefly in her hair, Ethan remained where he was, watching her leave, not with the urgency of someone trying to hold on, but with the stillness of someone finally understanding what had already been lost long before this room, long before this morning. And as the door closed softly behind her, the sound barely audible against the low murmur of voices, it marked something final, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. The end of an illusion he had built around himself, and the beginning of a truth he could no longer ignore, that she had never been standing behind him, not even once. She had simply chosen, until now, not to stand in front. The elevator doors closed with a soft, seamless glide, sealing Clara into a quiet that felt almost sacred after the controlled tension of the boardroom. And for a moment she allowed her shoulders to drop, just slightly, not in exhaustion but in release, as if she had been holding a breath for longer than she realized. And the mirrored walls reflected her from every angle, composed, steady. A woman who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to herself. And yet beneath that stillness there was movement, not chaos, not conflict, but a quiet unfolding of everything she had carried through months of being unseen, underestimated, reduced to a version of herself that had never been complete. And she thought briefly of the nights that had blurred into mornings, the soft weight of her child in her arms, the silence of a house that had once echoed with different expectations, and how in those hours, while the world had assumed she was absent, she had been rebuilding. Something far more permanent than appearances, something that did not rely on approval or recognition, something that could not be taken or dismissed with a careless sentence spoken under chandeliers. And the elevator chimed as it reached the lobby, the doors opening to a space filled with natural light, expansive and calm, the kind of place designed to impress without trying too hard. And as she stepped forward, the receptionist greeted her with a quiet respect that carried no surprise, only acknowledgement, as if her presence here was not an event but a constant. And outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Traffic flowing, people crossing streets, lives continuing without pause, unaware that anything significant had shifted at all. And Clara paused just before the glass doors, her hand resting lightly against the cool surface, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to feel it. Not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter, something deeper. A sense of alignment between who she had been forced to become and who she had always been beneath it all. And behind her, somewhere far above, Ethan was still in that building, still standing in a room that no longer belonged to him in the way he believed it did, still processing a reality that had already settled into place for her long before today. And she did not turn back, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. And as she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sunlight warming her skin, she adjusted her bag and began to walk, her pace unhurried, each step carrying her forward into a life that was not defined by reaction but by intention. And in that quiet movement, there was a kind of power that could not be announced, only recognized by those who understood what it meant to rebuild without witnesses, to rise without noise, and to stand, finally, in a space where no one could mistake her for anything less than exactly who she was. The car ride home was quiet in a way that felt different from before, not heavy, not uncertain, but settled, as if something inside Clara had finally stopped bracing for impact. And as the city passed by outside the window in a blur of glass and motion, she let her head rest lightly against the seat, her eyes following the reflections that shifted across the surface, each one a reminder of how many versions of herself had existed in these same streets. The woman who once waited for Ethan to come home late from meetings that never seemed to include her, the woman who learned to shrink her questions into silence, who adjusted her ambitions to fit the outline of his. And then the woman who sat alone in a quiet room, holding her newborn child in the early hours of the morning, the world reduced to the rhythm of breath and heartbeat, where time stretched in ways she had never known before. And in that stillness, something had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission. She had begun to see herself not as someone left behind, but as someone stepping into a different kind of life, one that did not need to be witnessed to be real. And when the car pulled up in front of her building, a low-rise structure set back from the noise of the main avenue, she stepped out into the soft afternoon light, the air carrying a hint of warmth that suggested the season was shifting. And inside, the space was calm, filled with small, deliberate choices that reflected her rather than anyone else, soft fabrics, warm tones, a sense of quiet that felt earned. And from the other room came a faint sound, gentle, familiar, and she moved toward it without hesitation, her steps instinctive, grounded in something deeper than thought. And when she reached the crib, She paused, looking down at the small, sleeping form, the rise and fall of breath. Steady, peaceful, untouched by the complexities that had defined her own journey, and her expression softened, not with fragility, but with a kind of strength that came from understanding what truly mattered. And she reached down, adjusting the blanket with careful hands, her movements slow, precise, as if each gesture carried meaning beyond itself. And in that moment, the contrast was complete. The world of glass towers and calculated conversations fading into something distant, almost irrelevant, because here, in this quiet room, there was no performance, no expectation to prove anything. Only the reality she had chosen, built, protected, and behind her, somewhere far away in both distance and understanding, Ethan was still unraveling the version of events he had believed in, still trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one who had just stepped into a role he could not comprehend. And Clara did not need to witness that process. She did not need to hear the questions or the apologies that might eventually come, because her clarity did not depend on his realization. And as she stood there, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the crib, she allowed herself a small breath, steady and complete, the kind that marked not an ending, but a continuation, a quiet forward movement into a life where she no longer needed to be seen to be understood, and where her silence was no longer mistaken for absence, but recognized, finally, as power. That night, the quiet did not feel empty. It felt earned, and Clara moved through her home with a rhythm that belonged entirely to her. The soft creak of the floor beneath her steps, the muted glow of a single lamp casting warm light across the room, everything deliberate, everything grounded in a life she had rebuilt piece by piece without needing anyone to witness it. And as she settled into the armchair near the window, the city beyond stretched out in a quiet shimmer of distant lights, a world still moving, still chasing, still measuring worth in ways she no longer recognized as her own. And her phone rested on the table beside her, silent for now, though she knew it would not stay that way for long, because somewhere across the city, realization was unfolding, not all at once, but in fragments, in questions that did not yet have answers, in conversations that would circle around the same point again and again until the truth settled into place. And she could almost see it. Ethan pacing in a room that suddenly felt too small, replaying every moment, every word, searching for the point where things had shifted, not understanding that nothing had shifted at all, that he had simply never seen clearly to begin with. And Clara leaned back slightly, her gaze soft but focused, not on him, but on the path that had brought her here, the quiet decisions made in rooms without applause, the hours spent learning, negotiating, understanding systems that did not reward noise but precision. And she remembered the first time she had signed her name on something that carried real weight, how her hand had paused for just a second, not from doubt, but from recognition. Because that moment had not been about proving anything to anyone else. It had been about stepping fully into something that had always been hers to claim. And now, sitting here, she did not feel the need to revisit that moment with pride or validation. It simply existed, part of a larger structure she had, built with intention, and the sound of soft movement from the other room drew her attention, a quiet reminder of the life that anchored everything else. And she stood, moving toward it without hesitation, her steps light, familiar, and when she reached the doorway, she paused, watching the gentle rise and fall of her child's breath, the small, steady rhythm that made everything else seem distant, almost secondary, and her expression softened again, not with vulnerability, but with a depth of purpose that did not require explanation. And behind her, the phone vibrated once, then again, the sound subtle but unmistakable, a signal from a world that was only now beginning to understand what she had already known. And she did not turn immediately. She did not rush, because whatever waited on the other end could wait a moment longer. And when she finally stepped back into the living room, her hand hovering briefly over the phone before picking it up, her expression remained unchanged, calm, composed, as if she were answering not a call, but a continuation of something that had already been decided. And as the screen lit up, reflecting in her eyes, there was no anticipation, no uncertainty, only a quiet readiness, the kind that came from knowing exactly who she was and no longer needing anyone else to define it for her. The screen glowed softly in Clara's hand, illuminating her face with a cool, steady light as the name appeared, and for a moment she simply looked at it, not with hesitation, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what this call represented, not urgency, not crisis, but consequence. And when she finally answered, she did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle on the other end. And when Ethan's voice came through, it was different, stripped of the effortless confidence that had once defined it, lower, measured, as if each word had to be considered before it was spoken. "Clara, I think we need to talk," and the phrasing was careful, almost formal, as though he were approaching something unfamiliar, something he no longer had control over. And she turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights flickered in the distance, steady and indifferent. And when she responded, her voice was calm, even, untouched by the tension that lingered between them. "You already said everything you needed to say." And there was no sharpness in her tone, no attempt to mirror the way he had once spoken to her, only clarity. And on the other end there was a pause, the kind that revealed more than any immediate reply could have, and she could almost hear him recalibrating, trying to find a position that made sense within a reality that had shifted beyond his expectations. "I did not understand," he said finally, the words quieter now, less certain, and Clara closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in pain, but in recognition of a pattern that had taken years to fully reveal itself. And when she opened them again, her reflection stared back at her from the glass, composed, unwavering. "You did not try to," she replied. And again, it was not an accusation. It was a statement, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret, and the silence that followed carried something heavier now, not tension, but realization, and Ethan exhaled audibly, the sound of someone standing at the edge of a truth they could no longer avoid. "I want to fix this," he said, and the words hung there, incomplete in a different way than before, because neither of them fully knew what this referred to anymore. The marriage, the perception, the imbalance he had only just begun to see. And Clara's expression did not change, her grip on the phone steady, her posture relaxed, because she was no longer standing inside that question. She had already stepped beyond it. "Some things are not broken," she said quietly. "They are just seen clearly for the first time." And this time the silence that followed was longer, deeper, stretching across the distance between them like a line that could not be crossed the way it once had been. And when Ethan spoke again, there was something else in his voice now, something closer to understanding, or perhaps the beginning of it. "Where does that leave us?" And Clara looked toward the other room, where everything that mattered most existed in quiet simplicity, untouched by the noise of ambition or the weight of expectation. And when she answered, her voice remained calm, steady, but carried a finality that did not need to be emphasized. "It leaves us exactly where we chose to stand." And with that, she did not wait for a response. She did not prolong the moment or soften its edges. She simply ended the call, the screen going dark in her hand, the silence returning not as an absence, but as a presence, full, complete, and entirely her own. The apartment settled back into stillness after the call ended, the kind of stillness that did not echo but held, as if the walls themselves understood that something irreversible had just taken place. And Clara stood there for a moment with the phone still in her hand, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen, steady, composed, untouched by the kind of doubt that used to follow conversations like that. And she placed the phone down without hesitation, the gesture quiet but definitive, as though setting aside something that no longer required her attention. And when she moved toward the kitchen, her steps were unhurried, her mind not racing, not replaying, because there was nothing left to reconsider, no words she wished she had said differently, no outcome she wanted to reshape. And as she poured a glass of water, the simple motion grounding her in the present, she felt the absence of something she had carried for years, a constant awareness of being evaluated, measured against expectations she had never fully agreed to. And now that absence felt like space, open and unclaimed, something she could fill on her own terms. And across the city, in a high-rise office that no longer felt as commanding as it once had, Ethan remained seated long after the room had emptied, the skyline stretching out before him in the same sharp lines that had once symbolized possibility. But now those lines seemed to shift, not physically, but in meaning, because every number, every projection, every plan he had built rested on a foundation he had not understood, and the realization did not arrive all at once. It moved through him slowly, in fragments, in connections forming between moments he had dismissed, the way Clara had stopped asking questions, the way she had withdrawn not in defeat, but in something quieter, something he had mistaken for absence, and now he saw it differently, not as a retreat, but as a repositioning, and the thought settled heavily, not as guilt, not as regret alone, but as a recognition of how much he had overlooked while believing he was in control, and he leaned back slightly, his hands resting against the edge of the table, his gaze unfocused as he tried to reconstruct a version of events that made sense. But every attempt led back to the same point, that he had been standing inside a narrative he had created, one that no longer held. And back in her apartment, Clara returned to the living room, the soft hum of the city outside blending with the quiet inside. And she sat once more near the window, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, as if she had stepped fully into a place where nothing needed to be proven. And as she looked out over the distant lights, her thoughts did not drift toward what had ended, but toward what remained, not in terms of loss or separation, but in clarity, in understanding, in the simple, undeniable fact that she no longer needed to be seen through someone else's lens to know her own worth. And in that quiet certainty, there was no urgency, no need to act or respond or reclaim anything, because everything she had built was already hers. And as the night deepened around her, the contrast between their worlds became complete, one still searching for answers within a structure that had shifted beyond recognition, and the other already standing on ground that did not move, not because it was fixed, but because it had been chosen, deliberately, quietly, and without the need for anyone else to validate it. Morning arrived without ceremony, a soft wash of light filtering through the curtains as the city resumed its quiet insistence on movement, and Clara woke not with urgency, not with the lingering weight of yesterday pressing against her chest, but with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar in its completeness, the kind that did not demand anything from her the moment her eyes opened. And she lay there for a brief second, listening, not for noise, but for absence, for the quiet that had once unsettled her and now felt like space, like something she had finally learned how to inhabit. And when she rose, her movements were unhurried, grounded in routine rather than reaction, the soft fabric of her robe brushing against her skin as she moved through the apartment, each step reinforcing a rhythm that belonged entirely to her. And in the other room, the gentle sound of her child stirring drew her forward, not as an interruption, but as an anchor, something that centered everything else. And as she lifted the small, warm weight into her arms, there was no conflict between the world she had stepped into yesterday and the one she stood in now. No contradiction between authority and tenderness, because she no longer saw them as opposing forces, but as parts of the same whole, and she held that understanding quietly, without the need to define it. And across the city, Ethan stood at the edge of his office window, the same skyline stretching before him, unchanged in structure but altered in meaning. And the phone on his desk had not stopped since early morning, messages, confirmations, follow-ups, all moving forward as if nothing had happened, as if the system itself did not recognize the shift he was still trying to process. And he had responded where necessary, his voice steady, his tone controlled. But beneath it, there was a recalibration taking place, a slow and deliberate attempt to understand not just what had happened, but how he had failed to see it. And as he replayed the meeting, the introduction, the quiet authority in Clara's voice, the way the room had adjusted without hesitation, he felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not defeat, not even regret in its simplest form, but awareness, the kind that did not allow for easy dismissal or quick correction. And he turned away from the window, his reflection catching briefly in the glass. And for the first time in a long while, he did not recognize the certainty in his own expression, because it had been replaced by something more complex, something that required him to reconsider the foundations he had built his identity on. And back in her apartment, Clara moved toward the window with her child resting gently against her shoulder, the city unfolding before her in soft morning light. and she did not think about the boardroom, or the call, or the version of events that had already begun to reshape themselves elsewhere, because none of that required her attention anymore. And as she stood there, the sunlight catching along the edges of the room, illuminating the quiet details of a life she had chosen, she understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that this was not a moment of victory, not a turning point marked by noise or recognition, but a continuation of something she had already become, and in that understanding, there was no urgency to move forward or to look back. Only a steady presence in the space she now occupied, a space defined not by what had been taken from her, but by what she had quietly, deliberately, and completely built on her own. By mid-morning, the world had already begun to rearrange itself around a truth it could not ignore, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet language of influence and recognition, in the way conversations shifted when certain names were mentioned, in the subtle recalibration of respect that moved through boardrooms and offices without ever being formally announced. And Clara sat at a long glass table once again. The same composed posture, the same measured presence, but this time there was no surprise in the room, no moment of revelation waiting to unfold, only acknowledgement, steady and unquestioned, as reports were reviewed and projections adjusted, her voice guiding the discussion with a calm authority that did not need to assert itself. And across from her, executives listened not because they were required to, but because they understood the weight behind each decision she made. And when she paused, the room held that pause, not filling it, not rushing past it, because her silence carried meaning now in a way it never had before in the spaces she once occupied. And as the meeting progressed, there was no mention of the previous day, no reference to the shift that had altered everything for one person in particular, because for everyone else in that room, nothing had changed. This had always been the structure, always been the reality, and the only difference was who had finally become aware of it. And miles away, Ethan sat in a smaller conference room, the glass walls around him reflecting a version of himself he was still trying to reconcile, his phone resting face down on the table, as if he needed a moment free from the constant stream of information that had once fueled him. And in front of him were documents, familiar in format but different in implication, agreements that now felt less like achievements and more like evidence of something he had not fully understood. And he traced a line of text with his eyes, reading the same clause for the third time, the name there unmistakable, undeniable, and he leaned back slightly, his hand pressing against his temple as he exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition of a pattern that extended beyond a single deal, beyond a single moment, something that reached back through months, perhaps years, of assumptions he had never questioned. And he thought of Clara not as she had stood in the boardroom, composed and untouchable, but as she had stood the night before, under warm light and quiet judgment, and the contrast settled heavily, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, because it revealed exactly how much he had failed to see. And back at the table, Clara closed the folder in front of her with a soft, definitive motion, signaling the end of the discussion, and as the others began to gather their materials, she remained still for a moment longer, her gaze steady, her expression calm, not reflecting on what had been revealed, not revisiting the moment of recognition that had unfolded elsewhere, because she had already moved beyond it. Her focus aligned with what came next, not in pursuit of validation, but in continuation of something that had never depended on it. And when she finally stood, the room adjusted once again, not dramatically, not with any visible shift, but with the quiet understanding that followed her presence. And as she walked toward the door, there was no need for acknowledgement, no need for confirmation, because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through the simple, undeniable weight of truth revealed without noise. The afternoon light softened as it filtered through the tall windows, casting long reflections across polished floors and glass surfaces that seemed to stretch endlessly. And Clara walked through the corridor with the same quiet certainty that had followed her all day, her presence no longer questioned, no longer misinterpreted, but fully understood in the spaces that mattered. And yet there was no sense of arrival in her steps, no pause to absorb recognition or acknowledgement, because she had never built her life around those things. And as she entered her office, a space defined not by excess but by intention, she set her folder down on the desk and allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, her gaze drifting toward the city beyond, the constant movement below continuing without interruption, unaware of the shifts that had taken place within structures it could not see. And behind her, the door opened softly, a measured knock preceding it, and one of her associates stepped in, respectful, composed, carrying an update that aligned with everything she had already anticipated. The next phase was in motion, approvals extending beyond a single project, influence reaching further than it had the day before, and Clara listened, not with surprise, but with the quiet focus of someone who had always understood the trajectory. And when the associate finished, she nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried finality, no need for elaboration, no need for reinforcement, because the direction had already been set. And as the door closed again, the silence that followed felt complete, not empty, not waiting, but settled. And across the city, Ethan found himself in a different kind of silence, one that did not offer clarity but demanded it, and he sat alone in his office, the glass walls no longer feeling like a symbol of openness but of exposure, as if everything he had believed to be solid was now visible in a way he could not ignore, and the documents in front of him remained unchanged. But their meaning had shifted entirely, and he ran a hand slowly across the surface of the desk, grounding himself in something physical, something that did not move, because internally, everything was still rearranging, and he thought again of Clara's words, not as statements meant to challenge him, but as truths that had always existed, waiting only for recognition. And for the first time, he did not try to respond to them, did not try to reshape them into something more manageable. He simply let them settle, and in that quiet acceptance, something else began to take form, not a plan, not a strategy, but an understanding, slow and deliberate, that control had never been what he thought it was, and that power, real power, did not announce itself, did not need validation, it simply existed, steady and unmoved by perception. And back in her office, Clara reached for her bag, the day already unfolding into its next sequence without resistance, without hesitation, and as she stepped toward the door, there was no need to look back, no unfinished conversation waiting to be resolved, because everything that needed to be said had already been expressed in the only language that mattered, the quiet, undeniable language of truth revealed without force. And as she walked forward, her reflection briefly catching in the glass beside her, it did not feel like a separate image, but an extension of something whole, something fully realized. And in that reflection, there was no trace of the woman who had once been defined by someone else's perception, only the presence of someone who had always known, even in silence, exactly who she was. Evening returned with a quiet kind of symmetry, the city lights rising one by one as if nothing had shifted, as if the day had not redrawn invisible lines between who held power and who only believed they did. And Clara stepped out of the building into the soft hum of traffic and distant voices, her pace steady, unhurried, the rhythm of her steps matching something internal that no longer needed to rush or prove or respond. And the air carried a subtle warmth, a reminder that seasons changed, whether anyone noticed or not, and she moved through it without resistance, her presence blending into the world rather than standing against it, because she no longer needed to be seen to be certain. And across the city, in an office still lit long after most had gone home, Ethan stood alone once more, his reflection stretched across the glass in front of him, no longer sharp, no longer defined by the certainty he had once worn like armor. And he did not look away this time, did not try to reshape what he saw into something more familiar, because there was no version of this moment that allowed him to return to what had been, and instead, he stood there and let it settle. The realization not dramatic, not overwhelming, but complete, that everything he had built had always rested on something he did not control, something he did not even recognize until it stood directly in front of him. And in that understanding, there was no immediate answer, no clear path to reclaim what he thought he had lost, only the quiet, unavoidable truth that some things were never his to begin with. And back in her apartment, Clara moved through the familiar space with ease, the soft light casting long shadows that felt more like extensions than distortions, and she paused once more by the window, her child resting peacefully in the next room, the steady rhythm of that small life anchoring everything else, and she looked out over the city not as something to conquer or navigate, but as something that simply existed alongside her, no longer defining her place within it. And in that stillness, there was no need to revisit the past, no need to measure what had been said or done, because none of it held the same weight anymore. And as she turned away from the window, her reflection catching briefly in the glass, there was a quiet completeness in what she saw. Not perfection, not triumph, but alignment, a sense that everything had settled into its rightful place without force, without noise, without the need for acknowledgement. And somewhere far above the streets, Ethan finally stepped back from the glass, his reflection dissolving into the dark as the room behind him dimmed, and for the first time, he understood that the absence of control was not a momentary setback, but a reality he would have to learn to live within, while Clara, without ever raising her voice, without ever demanding to be seen, had already stepped beyond it. And in the quiet contrast between them, there was no dramatic conclusion, no final confrontation waiting to unfold, only a truth that existed in its own steady form, that she had never needed to seek revenge, because she had become something far more powerful than that, something that did not react, did not pursue, but simply existed, undeniable and complete. And as the night settled fully over the city, the story did not end with a victory declared or a defeat acknowledged. It ended the way it had always been meant to, in silence, where everything that mattered no longer needed to be said.